I think, in that way. So we're moving on then to the final session for today, for, if you like, the kind of plenary lecture or the keynote, to pull everything together. And it's my great pleasure to introduce, to give that keynote, Professor Bryan Fanning. Bryan is Professor of Migration and Social Policy at the School of Social Policy, Social Work and Social Justice at University College Dublin. He's published and researched very widely on the impact of migration and how it's transformed Irish society. And in addition to that, he has research interests in the history of ideas and the debates relating to the modernisation of Irish society in the 20th century. And he's published widely on both of these subjects. His many books include Migration and the Making of Ireland in 2018, Three Roads to the Welfare State last year in 2021, Irish Adventures in Nation Building in 2016, and Histories of the Irish Future in 2014. That's a kind of small number of a kind of whole shelf of books that Bryan has published. And Bryan's going to talk to us this afternoon on the topic of Roadside Picnic, picking through the traces of the 1932 Eucharistic Congress. So Bryan, we're really looking forward to what you have to say, and over to you. You're going to speak straight to camera rather than from slides, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you for the welcome, and very much a thank you to Barry for organising. And thank you, everybody. It was a fascinating day, and I've learned an awful lot. It's humbling to always kind of get to see the research done by others and to basically be introduced to aspects of a topic that never occurred to one, and to basically see the work being done by everybody. I was struck when prepping this piece by a number of sweeping statements that opened some journal articles about the Eucharistic Congress. Now, sweeping statements are often necessary to get your audience in or to explain the relevance of your topic in a journal that's not really about the one topic. So we have to give a bit of latitude here. David Holmes, in an article from 2000 called The Eucharistic Congress of 1932, began by describing this as a flashpoint in the formation of a specific Irish Catholic identity that held much influence until recently in the Irish Free State and Republic. A few years later, an article by Jerry Kane wrote that it has since been regarded as the inauguration of a culture of Irish Catholicism which has endured for much of the 20th century. Now, these writers and many others who, in their accounts of the Eucharistic Congress, also argue that it symbolized the peak of Catholic influence in Irish society. As put by David Holmes, the Eucharistic Congress showcased the triumphal fruits of the devotional revolution that had commenced 80 years earlier. The orderly, regimented crowds who took part in various processions were, according to Holmes, in quotes, a great source of pride for Irish journalists, clergy, politicians and others who were happy to explode the myth of the inefficient and disorderly Irish. Yet systematic efforts by the Catholic Church in Ireland to educate and regulate its flock have been ongoing since Catholic emancipation, when Catholic emancipation a century earlier permitted it to openly organise a system of parish schools. A mid-19th century devotional revolution in Ireland followed the appointment of Ireland's first cardinal, Paul Cullen. His stewardship of the Church in Ireland brought religious practices into line with those of an international church that itself was adapting to the challenges of modernity. Cullen presided over a massive programme of church building and a new focus on public religious ceremonies. The post-1850 devotional revolution was exemplified by new religious practices, including the Rosary, benedictions, novenas, blessed altars, and devotion to the Sacred Heart and the Immaculate Conception, shrines, processions, and retreats. According to the sociologist Tom Inglis, the Church sought to impose a new discipline amongst the people by fostering rigid adherence to regulations and etiquette associated with religious practice. There were rules about dress and cleanliness, silence and posture. Obedience towards priests was fostered by the imposition of legalistic rules of religious and moral conduct and practices that applied to religious observance and sacraments. As put by Jerry Boyd, the new churches and devotional practices were imbued with a sense of theatre. Church architecture was deliberately expensive and elaborate and designed with a didactic or propagandist function to be the most spectacular building in any neighbourhood and to exert a holy influence over its surrounding hinterland. The pageantry of the 1932 Eucharistic Congress had a similar purpose. By the time of independence, the everyday culture of the 26 counties that comprised the Free State was intensely Catholic. An already well-established, mostly Catholic system of denominational schools, churches, and Gaelic sports, all organised at parish level, buttressed one another in shaping the beliefs and values of the hundreds of thousands of Irish people who attended events in Dublin or celebrated the Congress in their communities. The 1926 census identified 93% of the population of the Free State as Catholic. When its early governments engaged in a political auction to Catholicise the new state, they were arguably doing more than giving the people what they wanted. The previous Cumann na Gael governments between 1922 and 1932, led by W.T. Cosgrave, were comprised of demonstrably loyal Catholics. Cumann na Gael was perceived before the 1932 election by Rome as more friendly to the church than Fianna Fáil. Pius IX had bestowed a papal knighthood on Cosgrave in 1925. However, De Valera, as Peter Somerville Large put it, managed to out-Christian him. So the Eucharistic Congress coincided with the installation of a new premier who seemed determined to establish what Ronan Fanning called his impeccable Catholic credentials. It was the first major act of government that De Valera presided over. But it was also a bipartisan effort that, according to Kevin Whelan, drew a line under civil war hostilities. Hundreds of thousands of their fellow citizens witnessed De Valera and Cosgrave together bearing the canopy of the Blessed Sacrament from Phoenix Park to O'Connell Street. Several analyses of the Dublin Eucharistic Congress also emphasise how the 31st Eucharistic Congress marked the formal debut of the newly independent Irish Free State on the world stage. According to Jerry Kane, the Congress satisfied a craving for international recognition. Religion was a defining characteristic of the new state in its struggle to be different from the nearby colonial oppressor. As put by Rebecca Troger in a 2017 article, it was a nation-building exercise drawing on mass public ritual and display that put forward an image of a newly formed Irish nation unified under the banner of Catholicism. She depicted it as an international event which promoted a global cosmopolitan Catholicism and a diasporic Irishness. Troger's and some other analyses emphasise that the Congress was viewed by at least some organisers in Ireland and commentators at the time as an opportunity to put Ireland on the world stage, with a suggestion that it was both an expression of nationalist as well as religious devotion. Studies of Eucharistic Congresses held in other countries similarly argue that, from the vantage point of the countries that hosted these were understood to have a role in buttressing national prestige as well as a religious purpose. For example, Natalia Nunes-Bargueno argued that the Madrid Congress in 1911 was envisaged as bolstering national prestige at a time when, in the eyes of Spaniards, this had hugely declined. In 1898, Spain had lost its remaining overseas territories, including Cuba and the Philippines, to the United States. Spain had lost its earthly empire, but might still envisage itself at the centre of a spiritual one. The main long-run political beneficiaries of the Congress in Ireland were De Valera and the Reverend John Charles McQuaid, then president of Blackrock College, who organised the Garden Party there. McQuaid was an already influential rising star in the church in Ireland. De Valera had once taught mathematics at Blackrock College. Soon after De Valera's election in April 1932, McQuaid assured De Valera at an audience for the Blackrock College Union at government buildings that he could rely on the support of the Rock Men. In 1940, De Valera was appointed Archbishop of Dublin. His nomination was skillfully supported by De Valera, who made it clear through diplomatic channels to Rome that McQuaid was the most capable candidate. The Eucharistic Congress was held just 4 months after the election of the first Fianna Fáil government, and it provided De Valera with a platform to present himself as a Catholic statesman. This was an opportunity that he inherited rather than one that he made for himself. The campaign to secure Dublin as the venue for the 31st Congress and its staging had been planned before the 1932 election, when Fianna Fáil was in opposition. In November 1930, the Irish Times reported that Cosgrave had decided to hold the 1932 election before the Eucharistic Congress to avoid political clamours that might otherwise distract from it. Whilst De Valera benefited politically from the Congress, much of its organisation was led by other Catholic conservative leaders, and the efforts to bring the event to Ireland had been enthusiastically supported by Cosgrave's government and championed internationally by Irish diplomats. The Congress offered De Valera an early opportunity to flex the muscles of his new political power as he set about undermining the role of the Governor-General. In one breach of diplomatic protocol, the King's representative in Dublin, James MacNeill, was not invited to the state reception in Dublin Castle to welcome the papal legate. When organising the garden party at Blackrock College to welcome Cardinal Lowry, the legate, McQuaid took care, when arranging formal introductions to the papal legate, to keep MacNeill and De Valera from meeting. On the 22nd of May 1932, MacNeill complained in writing to De Valera about his embarrassment that his attempts to invite his own guests to the Congress, who would stay at the Vice-Regal Lodge, had been blocked by the Department of External Affairs. A second letter from MacNeill to De Valera sent after the Congress referred to the discourtesy which he had been treated by him and his ministers. A handwritten confidential memo to De Valera from Joseph P. Walsh, the Secretary of the Department of External Affairs, on the unfolding of these events, recalled how a week or 10 days after De Valera had taken office, Walsh told MacNeill, on De Valera's behalf, that it would be better for all concerned if the Vice-Regent issued no invitations to the Irish government to any events around the time of the Congress, and that invitations on behalf of the Governor-General to the Eucharistic Congress event itself should be postponed for the time being. Walsh described how he had been approached in person by MacNeill, who had worked himself into a state of pique and was boiling over about what Walsh agreed in his letter to De Valera was a deliberate, premeditated effort to undermine the Governor-General in anticipation of other efforts to assert Irish sovereignty. It has been argued that De Valera came to model his leadership style on that of an archbishop, or indeed a papal legate. As put by Patrick Murray in Oracles of God, the Roman Catholic Church in Irish Politics 1922 to 1937, De Valera, after his ascent to power following the 1932 election, began to simulate a clerical voice in his pronouncements on economic, social and educational issues. And a bit from what Murray had to say, he, De Valera, gradually assumed some of the style and functions of a lay cardinal. One of the early signs was his emergence as a semi-ecclesiastical personage, was his address to the papal legate at St. Patrick's Hall in Dublin Castle, and so on and so on. However, even before De Valera was elected, Catholic thought had influenced post-independence legislation on divorce, film and publication censorship, and alcohol. Such was the intellectual influence of Catholicism at the time that Irish political leaders, including De Valera and many others, invoked papal encyclicals in debates on social issues, the way that their equivalents these days refer to OECD reports or European Union reports. Irish politicians were part of the same culture as religious leaders like McQuaid, and the Jesuits De Valera consulted on the wording for the foreword to and several articles of the 1937 Constitution. For a number of decades, Catholicism proved to be a stronger national adhesive than the Irish language had been. However, just as Gaelic lost out to English during the 19th century, so eventually did the devout practice of Catholicism become a minority pursuit. The Congress hosted in Dublin was very similar in many respects to earlier and subsequent events hosted in other countries. By 1932, these had developed into large-scale international events, somewhat like the Olympics or World Cup, to which Catholic clergy and laity travelled in large numbers to profess their faith and detail their work in encouraging Eucharistic devotion in their own countries. The organisation of these very large gatherings came to involve not just planning committees of clergy and laity, but also civil government. A 1926 history of the Eucharistic Congresses to date at that time noted the official participation of the civil, federal, provincial and municipal civil authorities in the organization of the 1910 Montreal Congress, which had attracted at that time some 500,000 visitors to the city. The director of organization of the Dublin Congress, Frank O'Reilly, had been president of the Catholic Truth Society since 1918. The Catholic Truth Society, led by O'Reilly, but guided by clerics such as McQuaid, operated behind the scenes to maximize Catholic influence upon the state and its institutions. A 1932 article on the origins of the Eucharistic Congress, Congresses in general, by Charlotte Kelly, published in the Irish Monthly, emphasized the organizational role of lay Catholic action movements in the planning of earlier such events. The first International Eucharistic Congress took place in Lille, a predominantly industrial town in northern France. In 1881, lay Catholic leaders had campaigned for such an event to be held in the city. Lille, like many other Catholic parts of Europe and Ireland, experienced a devotional revolution, which had been encouraged by the Church in Rome as a response to the threat of secular modernity. The Catholic Action Movement in Lille promoted a calendar of events beyond the celebration of the Mass aimed at intensifying religious devotion. It organized social guilds, working men's clubs, as well as religious conferences, confraternities, and prayer groups. A similar kind of Catholic civil society developed in Ireland during the same period. The revival of Catholic religious processions in the late 19th century has been explained by the Church's desire to increase its visibility in what were becoming increasingly secularized urban settings. As put by Nunes Bargueno, the congresses that were organized in Madrid, Chicago, Dublin, Buenos Aires, and many other important cities were ritual occupations of urban space. Congresses were also held in cities where the Church's presence in the public sphere was legally or politically contested, including London in 1908, where Asquith's Liberal Party government, put under pressure by the mobilization of Protestant public opinion, prohibited a formal Eucharistic procession. The papal legate's opening address declared that the goal of the London Congress in 1908 was to give English Catholics a renewal of piety and zeal for the Holy Eucharist, and to bring back Protestant England to the worship of the Eucharist. Most congresses were held in Catholic majority cities, where the aim was to fight against the encroachment of secularism rather than to reverse the Reformation. The first Eucharistic Congress in Lille in June 1881 was held just 2 weeks after a law was passed in France prohibiting the teaching of religion in schools. As put by Peter Costello in his lucid introduction to an edition of Chesterton's fairly bonkers Christendom in Dublin, its purpose was to create a counterweight against state anti-clericalism. I'll come back to the Chesterton thing in a while. In Ireland as elsewhere, the Congress meant different things to people at the time and to those who have written about these from future vantage points. Charlotte Kelly's 1932 history of Congresses, leading up to the one held in Dublin, was principally focused on devotional motives to celebrate the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. However, Ireland's campaign to secure the 31st Congress for Dublin involved secular politicians and diplomats, as well as lay Catholic organizations. Irish diplomats in the United States and Rome at the time saw the conference as an opportunity to lever recognition of the Irish Free State, but also played a role in promoting the influence of Irish clerics like McQuaid within the Church. To some extent, the kind of coalition that came together to bring the 1932 Congress to Dublin, or similar campaigns put together by some other countries, might be likened to efforts to host the Olympics or World Cup. All such bids have to engage with external institutional decision-making processes, lobby institutional figures within these, and demonstrate they can manage the logistics of huge international events. The 29th Congress, held in Chicago, drew an estimated 1 million pilgrims, thousands of clerics, and there were huge processions. Like the subsequent Dublin event, there had been a huge amount of planning. 30 telegraph lines were specially constructed to enable the international press to cover the event. A 96-minute film of the event was screened to Catholics around the world. Eucharistic Congresses were transnational events aimed at impressing international audiences that cannot be understood by solely focusing on local cultural, political and ideological contexts, as put by Cecile van der Pellen-Diagre in her analysis of Belgian media coverage of the 1926 Chicago Congress. And this is a quote: "The journalists were impressed, even shaken, by the huge scale of the Congress, the splendor of the religious settings and the robes, as well as by the extraordinary organization that the Congress required, feeding, housing and transporting almost 1 million people. They were also very much surprised by the mobilization of the Catholic minority. Lastly, they mentioned their surprise regarding the vastness of spaces occupied by the crowds. The famous and very modern Soldiers Field Stadium, inaugurated in 1924, where many of the ceremonies were held, left a lasting impression, with 400,000 people having gathered there." So lots there that's very similar to how the Irish event was spoken about. In July 1929, Michael McWhite, an Irish Washington-based diplomat, reported to Dublin on an audience with Cardinal Mundelein of Chicago, at which Mundelein declared he would support the proposal for hosting the Eucharistic Congress of 1932 in Dublin. The Archbishop's main concern was about Ireland's ability to host a large number of international visitors. He thought his own diocese alone would send 10,000 people, and that perhaps 50,000 might travel from the United States. The 31st Congress held in Dublin was a similarly huge logistical event to its predecessor in Chicago. Like earlier congresses, it was designed to garner attention around the world, or at least its Catholic parts. Whilst interpretations of various Eucharistic congresses focus on how these were vehicles for nationalism, they were events, as I say again, with significance for international audiences. Countries seeking to host a Eucharistic Congress had to win transnational support within the hierarchy. In 1901, the Pope had appointed the Bishop of Namur in Belgium, Monsignor Helen, to preside over a permanent committee on of the International Eucharistic Congresses, a function that Bishop Helen still held when the decision to locate the 31st Congress was held in Dublin. Whilst applications to hold a Congress came from clergy and Catholic action movements, governments and their diplomats also became involved in such bids. In an undated 1929 memorandum, Charles Bewley, the Irish envoy to the Holy See, reported to Walsh in Dublin a conversation with a cardinal in Rome who had a role in determining whether Ireland would be chosen to host the 1932 event. And they were discussing a rival bid from Argentina to hold the 31st Congress. According to Bewley, the success of the celebrations to mark the centenary of Catholic emancipation in Ireland stood in its favour, as did the symbolism of a Congress that would commemorate 1,500 years of Christianity in Ireland. Concerns about the lack of political stability in Argentina were understood to work against the application to host the Congress there in Buenos Aires at that time. Bewley's report suggested that the decision where to hold the Congress involved a range of senior Catholic Church figures and needed to take into account logistical issues involved in gathering large numbers of church leaders. So, for example, Bewley was told at his meeting that Australian bishops had petitioned to be allowed to defer a visit to Rome so that they could also attend the Congress to Dublin at the same time. So, in other words, coming from one side of the world to another in 1931, they were expected to go to Rome, but instead basically said, can we not go next year and go to Dublin at the same time? But that's how Australians view Europe, all one little bitty place. In 1934, the 32nd Congress was held in Buenos Aires. Argentina was perhaps as politically divided as Ireland had been in the aftermath of its civil war. An analysis of the 34th Congress, the one in Buenos Aires by Jesus Mendez, highlights a number of parallels with the Irish case. It was viewed in Argentina at the time and subsequently to have fostered intense feelings of civil camaraderie. Campaigns by the Church in Argentina during the 1920s to win support from the Permanent Committee of the International Eucharistic Congress were unsuccessful. When Buenos Aires lost out to Chicago as the site of the 1926 Congress, the volatile relations between church and state at the time in Argentina were a factor. A coup in 1930 changed the political landscape. Whilst it was supported by many Catholic conservatives, it was not condoned by the Church, which prohibited members of Acción Católica, the Catholic Action Movement there, from becoming members of political parties. The Buenos Aires Congress was organized by Acción Católica, Argentina, the country's chapter of the Worldwide Catholic Action Movement, and by clerics and so on. But by apparently standing back from politics at a time when Argentinian society became very polarized, the Church gained status as a force for national reconciliation. Yet the organization of the Congress was dominated by Argentina's far right, and efforts by President Justo to cement his authority by embracing the Church are being seen to do so. The year before the Congress, Justo proposed to Rome to double the number of bishops in Argentina from 10 to 20, and to create several new archbishoprics in a move calculated to add to the legitimacy of his government. So by comparison, Irish efforts during the years leading up to the 1932 Congress to build up diplomatic relations with the Vatican were bipartisan. Irish diplomats led by Walsh under Cumann and Gale governments had been preoccupied with building formal relations with the Vatican. They sought to secure international recognition for the Free State, but were also personally enthusiastic as Catholics to bring about closer relations with Rome. Walsh, Ireland's chief diplomat, had been a teacher at Clongowes, a Jesuit-run school that educated many members of Ireland's political elite while preparing for ordination. He left the Jesuits in 1915, but remained devoutly Catholic. In a March 1930 letter to Bewley in Rome, Walsh wrote about his plans to encourage the Vatican to assign a papal nuncio to Dublin. The flying of the papal flag above the nuncio's formal residence would be, according to Walsh, a constant reminder to the people of Ireland that Rome had come amongst them, and that the benign influence of the Holy Father would henceforth be more directly exercised on their behalf. So Walsh was very Catholic and very supportive of the idea of Catholic influence, independent of his role as basically seeing this as beneficial to the Irish state. The political context in Argentina was different than the Irish case. Political conflict in Argentina was predominantly between Catholic conservatives and left secularists. Under Argentina's 1853 Constitution, Article 2, Catholicism was described as the country's preeminent religion, whilst at the same time reserving for the state the power to veto any ecclesiastical decree. There have been clashes between church and state over episcopal appointments. An 1884 law prohibited religious instruction during school hours in public schools. Another law passed during the 1880s made civil marriages a prerequisite for the recognition of religious matrimonial ceremonies. European immigration was another factor that eroded the influence of the church. Although many who migrated to Argentina were Catholics, they were often less tradition-bound. For example, secularist immigrants from Italy influenced the growth of socialism in Argentina. There had been a high-profile conflict between church and state in 1923 when the then Radical Party government supported a candidate, Monsignor Miguel de Andrea, who was not confirmed by the Vatican. So rather than being levered by secular politicians, as the Irish Congress was, to bolster the country's post-colonial sovereignty, the Buenos Aires Congress was promoted as a celebration of European Christian colonization and ideologically influenced by the growth of Hispanismo, a preoccupation with Argentina's Spanish roots. The Buenos Aires Congress was scheduled for the 10th to 14th of October 1934, which coincided with the Dia de la Raza, which commemorated the discovery by the Spanish of the New World, and the decision to hold the Eucharistic Congress in Argentina had been strongly supported by Spanish bishops. The legacy of the Buenos Aires Congress, according to Jesus Mendez, whose 1985 analysis I draw on here, was not what its Argentinian lay and clerical organizers hoped for. The national reconciliation engendered by the Congress in Argentina was at best temporary. Justo was unable to bind church and state together, or the church to himself. In 1938, the church hierarchy in Argentina distanced itself from the Catholic far right by issuing a pastoral letter which condemned the doctrine of the totalitarian state. By comparison, the 1932 Congress in Dublin had a longer lasting impact on Irish society, although its significance would in time fade from collective memory. The Dublin Congress was described at the time and subsequently as a hugely influential event, or hugely significant event. According to the De Valera-owned Irish press, on the day after the Congress came to an end, it was the greatest experience our race has ever known. The Irish Independent published a souvenir of the Congress aimed at recording its events in, quote, a manner that will help perpetuate a golden memory of Ireland's great manifestation of faith and piety and her allegiance to the chair of Peter, close quotes. The introduction of the Eucharistic Congress record published by the Irish Independent would also, its publisher claimed, enable Ireland's exiled children to point with pride to the way in which the motherland had shown her undying loyalty to the Eucharistic King. For some decades after the 1932 Congress, until Catholicism went into decline, the Congress was a benchmark against which subsequent expressions of religious devotion might be measured. In 1948, Archbishop McQuaid wrote a letter describing how he had convinced the Labour Party and trade unions to ally with Catholic lay organisations to make the traditional for socialist May Day celebrations a day of protest against the imprisonment of Cardinal Joseph Mandinski by the Hungarian government. McQuaid described how the Labour Party aligned itself with Catholic sodalities and confraternities, and how, to quote McQuaid's letter, the papal flag flew alone on the headquarters of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, where the Citizens' Army had flown its plough and stars in former times, close the quote. This exemplified, McQuaid declared, a practical devotion to the Mass and the sacraments, such as even the Eucharistic Congress of 1932 had not exceeded. In 1954, the centenary of the Dogma of Immaculate Conception celebrations of Marian devotion in Dublin included a procession in Dublin of tens of thousands of people, many of them trade unionists, and this again drew favourable comparisons with the 1932 Congress. In 1948, the Golden Jubilee of the Pioneer and Total Absence Association was described by Dermot Ferrer in his book on this as unbridled Catholic triumphalism and as the biggest public celebration of Catholicism in Ireland since the Eucharistic Congress of 1932. Some 80,000 pioneers attended a Mass and benediction at Croke Park. A similar Jubilee Mass in Croke Park in 1959 was attended by some 90,000 people. In his analysis of the architecture and visual culture of the Dublin Congress, Gary A. Boyd notes that the architectural interventions that define the critical spaces of the event, a Roman-style triumphal arch making its exit from Phoenix Park and the Celtic Round Tower constructed at College Green, the altar on O'Connell Street, they were like movie sets built from timber and other lightweight materials. And all the flags and bunting were built to be almost immediately be dismantled. The Congress was, according to Boyd, an ephemeral and decidedly modern media event designed to temporarily transform Dublin into a vast cathedral that could be filmed and photographed for consumption by Catholics around the world. However, little trace remained when the circus struck its tent and left town. For a time, the Congress remained part of folk memory, and we've heard about this and how erratic that memory can be. However, such memories fade, and as the generations pass, and outside the kinds of specialist circles such as the one here today within academia, and shrinking ones of devout Irish Catholics, it has come to mean so much less than it once did. Roadside Picnic, a science fiction novel by Arkady and Boris Straczynski, published in 1972, tells the story of investigators who enter into one of several zones around the world that have been inexplicably changed following visitations by aliens. The zones contained artifacts that are beyond the comprehension of the book's human protagonists. The title of the book comes from an analogy drawn by one of the characters in which he describes himself and his fellow investigators as akin to forest creatures who come upon the remains of a picnic after the humans have driven away. So the litter and bits of machinery and indeed relics left behind by the Straczynski brothers' alien picnickers were ordinary to these, but incomprehensible to the people who came upon these later. The stages and arches that had been erected for the Congress have long since vanished, although the event has been preserved in photographs and on films. A post I came across on Twitter explained that a massive roundabout in Crumlin, and Tony McGrath referred to this earlier, where a few years ago I gave driving lessons to my daughter, had been designed to represent a Eucharistic badge from 1932, itself based on the Celtic Cross of Cong, and the piece likened the road layout as viewed from the air as a Catholic crop circle. I imagine I was not alone amongst those who moved to the area in recent decades not to have known what this piece of 1930s urban design was supposed to signify. Nor did I know until recently that my wife's long deceased Aunt Carrie was named for the Eucharistic Congress. What particular experience of her Longford parents from 1932 motivated this name being given to their child, I cannot find out. Roadside Picnic was loosely adapted as the basis of Andrei Tarkovsky's classic film Stalker, which strips out much of the science fiction paraphernalia but ramps up the metaphysics. And in the movie, three explorers enter a zone which does not operate according to the same rules as the outside world. Tarkovsky's zone, like the urban sites of Eucharistic congresses, remain to some extent incomprehensible to 21st century pilgrims like ourselves. The roadside picnic analogy, of course, has its limits. It draws attention to how ontological differences and cultural change over time make it difficult to fully understand how past experience were experienced. Outside of a small specialist academic literature, writings about Irish history have reduced the 1932 Congress to a footnote. Present-day academic and other readers cannot be presumed to know what a sodality is, or a benediction, or even the meaning of the doctrine of the Eucharist or the Blessed Sacrament. Dermot Ferriter, in his 674-page opus, Occasions of Sin, Sex and Society in Modern Ireland, a book about Catholic influence in Irish society and its decline, gives the 1932 Congress just 1.5 paragraphs. And that's very typical for a lot of history books, but his concludes with a joke. The Congress, I'm quoting Dermot Ferriter's book now, seemed to indicate that Ireland was a Catholic state for a Catholic people and undoubtedly contributed to a more pronounced sense of exclusion for non-Catholics. But it may have stirred the passions of some Irish Catholics in ways that could not be repeated. When the fledgling current affair magazine McGill conducted a survey of changing Irish sexual habits in 1978, it was told that a prominent Dublin publican who was asked when he had last had sexual relations with his wife paused and replied, "I think it was the time of the Eucharistic Congress." In a 2012 radio interview, Ferriter repeated the same quip and added that devotion to the faith was not incompatible with getting the ride in 1932. But for that particular individual, there was to be a long famine of the flesh thereafter. Dermot, as the RTE website summary of this interview recording put it, and because the website's very colloquial, can certainly tell a story. But why tell that particular story? Ferriter, after all, was the author of A Nation of Extremes, The Pioneers in 20th Century Ireland, a book that he brought out in 1999, which is a seminal contribution to the literature on Irish Catholic movements. Ferriter's subsequent dismissive account of the Congress in Occasions of Sin and the repetition of its centerpiece anecdote in the 2012 RT program was presumably aimed at a post-Catholic audience who preferred irreverent stories about Ireland's Catholic past to ones about faith and devotion. Ferriter, in Occasions of Sin, appears to have a limited interest in explaining Catholic beliefs, doctrine, social thought, or mentalities to his 21st century readers, or to have concluded that these were of little interest to these. It exemplifies perhaps a pragmatic populist approach to Ireland's Catholic past. Pragmatic in the sense that the philosopher Richard Rorty used the term to argue that beliefs and ideas of the past should be of no concern to us if they do not serve our purposes. Ferriter argued in his book, The Transformation of Ireland in 2000, that some Irish people around the time of the Congress merely went along with the expectations that they participate in the patterns of Catholic life in towns or cities with a sequence of solemnities, masses, and retreats. So according to Ferriter, they towed the line when the preachers appeared, but, in quotes, remained somewhat anarchic when they had departed. Similarly, in June 2012, in the Irish Times article that presumably led to him being invited onto the Sean O'Rourke programme, and that article was called by the Irish Times Pope and Ceremony, how the 1932 Congress melded church and state. Ferriter inferred that Catholic beliefs were imposed through a focus on communal devotion, conformity, and obedience, rather than genuinely felt. Somewhat similarly, sociologists like Tom Inglis portray Catholic belief and patterns of religious observance as the consequence of top-down systems of moral regulation and social control. And it was the view of some church leaders that without the imposition of such religious discipline and the control of public morality by laws that shored up Catholic values, that religious devotion in Ireland might collapse like a house of cards. The evidence for this was that many Irish Catholics ceased to practice their religion once they left Ireland. Backsliding amongst emigrants became the subject of a number of articles in The Furrow, a Catholic intellectual magazine during the 1950s. A 1954 article, The Irish in Britain, noted that some emigrants seem to be able to shake off their religion as soon as they shake off the dust of Ireland from their shoes. The Irishman at home, Father Eamon Gaynor wrote, was treated as a child, constantly under supervision and never encouraged to think for himself. When he leaves home, he runs amok, and even if he doesn't, he remains stunted, never maturing into a responsible Christian man. A 1957 article in The Furrow by Frank Duff, founder of the Legion of Mary, concluded from an investigation into religious observance amongst Irish emigrants that 10% practice worthily, that is, unfailing Mass, frequent communion, 40% practice unworthily, that is, late for Mass, irregular, infrequent Holy Communion, 50% do not practice, and a substantial portion of the latter are alleged to have no faith. At home, all these people looked like good Catholic soldiers, yet they were destined to go down with their first encounter with irreligion. An official church research project led by Anthony W.C.W. Spencer, undertaken in advance of the 1960 Congress of the International Catholic Migration Commission, amplified such anxieties. Spencer's report, Arrangements for the Integration of Irish Immigrants in England and Wales, was suppressed and not made public until 2005. The report concluded that many Irish practicing Catholics were such only because their lives were under such a degree of scrutiny that they saw no possible alternative. Yet, many of those who participated in the 1932 Congress must have been genuinely devout, or at least have felt that religious practice was an integral part of their lives. There are no good ethnographies or anthropological studies of Catholicism in urban Ireland in the 1930s to which to turn. G.K. Chesterton's Christendom in Dublin is routinely cited in articles about the Congress, but it's a hyperbolic mess of rhetorical enthusiasm for Catholicism, as idolized by its author, that veers away from events in Dublin at every opportunity. However, Chesterton and indeed papers today emphasize the genuine religious devotion of ordinary Dubliners. The poorer the streets, the richer were the street decorations. Chesterton argued that the reason the Congress went so smoothly and was managed so successfully was because everybody who attended passionately wished the ceremony to be a success. In New Dubliners, Urbanization and the Irish Family, a book published in 1966, an excellent ethnography of the lives of ordinary people living in the city, Alexander J. Humphreys, who was a Catholic priest, described how religious devotion was still integral to the lives of people who would have been adults at the time of the 1932 Congress, even if some religious practices and devotions, such as the Rosary, were already in decline. A case study of a family who lived near the Guinness Brewery, where one of its members worked, described how religion was integral to part of their home and community life. In the downstairs room of their small terraced house where the family spent most of its time, there was a small shrine to the Sacred Heart, and upstairs an altar dedicated to the Blessed Virgin. Before each of these, a vigil light burned all the time, and both were decorated with flowers and additional lights on special feast days during the year. The house also contained several crucifixes, religious paintings, and statues. The ordinary speech of the family and their neighbours was heavily laden with religious expressions, references, and allusions. The father of the family visited the pub several evenings a week, but also went to Mass every day. And all members of the family visited the Sacred Sacrament every day. That is, they went to church to pray in front of the Eucharist. Many of the interpretations of the Eucharistic Congress referred to earlier in my piece focus on the stakes as identified by non-religious actors, while some address the political goals of devout Catholics. However, few of the academic analyses that I have cited earlier show much interest in spiritual motives or beliefs. They tend implicitly or otherwise, as Humphreys put it in New Dubliners, to think of religion as only having a functional therapeutic value or as playing a role in the organization of society. Some follow Karl Marx in depicting religion as the opium of the people, or indeed as a form of false consciousness. Many don't address the importance of religious devotion to participants in these, and instead focused on how the Eucharistic Congresses were variously expressions of political power, nationalism, and or gender identities. In performing Catholic masculinities in early 20th century Spain, the International Eucharistic Congress of Madrid in 1911, a very good recent article by Natalia Núñez Bargueno, acknowledges the influence of the thought of Judith Butler on her own analysis. Now, Butler's work reflects on how gender has been socially constructed or imagined and how it has been performed or is performed within the wider power structures of society. Núñez Bargueno is concerned with how gender identity was performed through the rituals and devotional acts of the 1911 Congress. She considers how ideas of masculinity that found expression in the ceremonies of the Madrid Congress in 1911 are difficult to understand from a secular 21st century perspective. Tens of thousands of men marched in processions that excluded women, yes. These men were encouraged to think of themselves as lay soldiers of the church. However, they were also urged by their lay religious organizations to express a deep sense of morality and a particular spiritual sensibility that would often move them to tears. She reflected that the sacred host was carried through the streets of the capital, Madrid, for over 4 hours under a pitiless summer sun. And the experience of that put many of these pilgrims perhaps into a state of significant penitential, as well as a physical test. So the meanings of these intense experiences, and therefore of Eucharistic Congresses to many who participated in these, are inevitably difficult for present-day non-religious readers to grasp. Most such readers will find more common ground with Judith Butler than with the writers and theologians who articulate Catholic beliefs. The language used by the clergy in Catholic periodicals and newspapers at the time of the Congress suggests a very different worldview than that of our time. When the Eucharistic Congress record published by the Irish Independent was published, it variously described things as magnificent and scenes as inspirational scenes of religious devotion. And this is hardly misrepresenting events in the way, say, that Donald Trump did when he proclaimed that his own inauguration ceremony had drawn record crowds. There is a gulf between Butler's postmodern theorizations of what it is to be human and the beliefs about human nature, original sin, supernatural personalism, and sex roles that found expression in church doctrine and practice, in the symbolism of the 31st Congress, or indeed the habitus, in other words, the ordinary ways of living of its lay and clerical participants. What they experienced through their participation in that event, or what religiously devout Catholics felt in Dublin in 1932, what they thought of the Congress was for, and the meaning it had for their lives, remain difficult to grasp from today's predominantly secular European vantage point. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Brian, thank you for that absolutely fantastic lecture. Ranging from Catholic emancipation to 1970s science fiction, and geographically from Madrid and Lille through Chicago to Buenos Aires and then back to Dublin. Again, absolute tour de force. I'm sure there will be many questions that people want to ask. So let's move straight into Q&A and throw it open. So anyone wants to ask a question, just press the hand icon on your screen, and I'll ask you to put it directly to Brian. Who wants to start? Thomas.
Hi, Thomas.
You're muted.
Thanks, Peter. Sorry, and thank you, Brian. Very interesting. When I was just trying to gauge, when would you trace then in terms of when Catholicism became more weaker, if you will, like you mentioned the furrow, but also doctrine and life was also questioning the quality of people's faith in the 1950s. Is it that period, or when the Catholicism was seemingly at its strength, was there a complacency in terms of making sure that people's faith would remain and could withstand the whatever modernity was they're going to face? I don't know how you'd...
It could come at that question quite a number of ways, really.
Yeah.
First of all, in the 1950s, there were these articles where essentially various Catholic voices were saying, we haven't really prepped people to be independent in their faith. And that was basically a critique of Irish Catholicism, generally speaking. that he kind of enforced or imposed a certain kind of cultural conformity rather than sort of deep religious belief or faith. So various kind of religious figures such as Jeremiah Newman, who was probably the best Catholic sociologist of them all, he would have been very clear that without a very strict set of rules, without basically laws in force, Catholic public morality, by which I mean Catholic beliefs institutionalized in law and so on and so forth, that things would come apart in time. But sociologists like Newman were also quite aware of processes of secularization, which they would have linked, as other sociologists do, to changing education levels, urbanization, and so on and so forth. So there's sort of two things I'm kind of saying there really is one, that there is basically, if you will, this sociological critique of Catholicism, which argues that it's kind of imposed. At the same level, there is this sense that basically Catholic beliefs and ways of life and have deep meaning for many people as well. So both of these things can be true at the same time, but they're just not true of everybody. And the statistics will tell a different story over time. In other words, as religious beliefs or levels of religious practice decline. So, it depends on how you come at it. If you come at it qualitatively, families such as the ones looked at by Humphreys in his New Dubliners book are intensely Catholic. They live in an intensely Catholic world in the inner city near Guinness's. But basically, this then is something that is quite perhaps changes over time. When I would think of this myself, I would reflect my own life in the sense that I'm what, 57 or so. 57. I kind of grew up in a Catholic family where both parents don't go to church anymore, but they were very devout at the time in the 70s. I remember benedictions and devotions and all those kinds of things. I don't think my children would know what those things are now. So definitely there has been a sort of a mass forgetting of the rituals, generally speaking, in much of Irish society, although not in all places. Funerals, for example, still persist as a culturally important phenomenon. An Irish rural funeral is a thing to behold. I certainly would love one if I die. When I die, not soon, hopefully. But the thing of it is that much of the sort of, if you will, the folkways and cultural practices, they have gone to one side, to the extent that tiles over doorways in Ennis, my hometown, we don't know when exactly they came or what they were for, or why exactly they were introduced. So things get lost very quickly to memory. But I guess my point really here is aimed to some extent at academics, because academics write journal articles to basically get published. They write them to insert, if you will, things they care or find interesting international debates. The big themes are topics such as nationalism, politics, and so on and so forth. So in these kinds of contexts, we tend to think of events like the Eucharistic Congress as things we can look at that then allow us to examine and understand various other things that were going on in society at that time, such as, for example, Irish diplomatic history, which I alluded to. So these are very, very valid things to do. But what seems to be missing in much of the sort of published stuff that I came across, and certainly in the more recently published historical books, is in the older ones, the presumption was people knew what it was to be a Catholic. In the newer ones, the presumption is nobody really cares. And I'm kind of simplifying greatly in saying that, but nevertheless, that would stack up if you went through the texts and looked at them, I think, a fair bit. So that's a bit of a concern as well. So that basically points, I guess, to the kinds of event we have today, where some of what we've heard today has been incredibly nuanced and incredibly detailed and incredibly about actual people and communities and actual settings, and to make sense of things. And of course, specialists will understand certain areas of historical past very, very well. But in the general round of things, something like the Eucharistic Congress gets reduced from what might have been the huge seminal event, the event that, like Ozymandias said, that will never be forgotten. Look at my works, you mighty and despair. The statue that is forgotten in the desert. The people won't necessarily know what this is into the future, unless, of course, they read about it. So that much of what it stood for, what it meant, what people thought it would mean, and what it said about Ireland has been set to one side. So there are a number of different things going on here, I think, Thomas. But certainly, in terms of a genealogy or a timeline for reduction of Catholicism, you go at it empirically by looking at mass attendance, urbanization, education levels, and those kinds of things. And then you kind of find behind the scenes that, yes, there are some very interesting studies at certain times that are quite frank at the extent to which perhaps people were tied to the practice of religion very much by local cultural stuff. And that's all sociologists would sort of say that if you live in a community where your membership of community is essentially a contract you share with others in the same village or neighborhood, because you all have the same way of life, the same social practices, you were born, live and die in sight of the same church steeple, what basically Ferdinand Toynes called Gemeinschaft, that solidarity of resemblance of traditional societies, that of course in an urban or diverse society where you don't know who your next door neighbor is, let alone whether they go to mass or not, things will change. So basically the ways in which basically mass beliefs and ideas and values are shared in a sort of a 21st society are going to be quite different than one of society that was predominantly rural, in one where people invested quite a lot of time not just going to mass, but I think the whole point of the Catholic Action Movement was mass is great, but let's just fill the weekdays and nights with all these other things. Let's just add loads of extra Catholic ceremonies on. Let's add benedictions in. Let's add in things to celebrate. Let's not just have saints and feast days and Easter and Christmas. Let's have all these other things as well. And it was about basically making religion omnipresent at a time when, if you will, the European society was modernizing, and the danger was it was going to secularize. So it was really about ramping up commitment at a time when there were forces running in the other direction.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Let's go to Ian next.
Hello. I'm sorry, I have a phone going here. I'll stop it. That's okay. Hello. Yeah, another eye opener. Brian, thank you so very much, particularly the sort of comparison both in time and space, because I think it puts the Congress into a context which perhaps it allows us to understand it better, because it's broader. But what interests me, well, you know, my interests are in Southern Protestant history. But I'm picking up all sorts of familiar tropes and feelings from you about what you were saying about faith and devotion and everything else, because my both my study of the history of Southern Protestantism and indeed I'm old enough now to have experienced it, is that that sense of religiosity, if you like, is not foreign to certainly to Southern Anglicanism, and in fact certainly in amongst Presbyterians and Methodists it could be even held to be even stronger.
Oh, yeah.
In the period you're talking about. I think it's not just a Catholic thing. It's a decline. It's the decline in religiosity. Like you, my children, you know, are the old saw is that they are spiritual, but they are not denominational or religious, and that broadly, I think, it more or less sums it up. So I think we're talking here about a world, you know, the movement of world views over time periods, yeah. Which are actually more common amongst groups that apparently are either opposed to each other or indifferent to each other than perhaps we give credence for.
Yeah, certainly. You know, I mean, the thing about I'm just doing other research at the moment, and one of the things I'm looking at is the Southern Baptist congregation in quite detail.
Oh yeah.
And how they respond, if you will, to many of the challenges they see it of an America where, from their point of view, their kind of religiosity is losing the war in terms of the battle for values, or at least for public morality, or indeed what American civil religion. So there will be, so you know, the strategy is to invest more and more and more, and to try to dig down and dig in, and try and create a sort of a world within which you're experiencing your faith. You're experiencing others who are experiencing your faith. Ideally, you're not experiencing people who don't have faith. So therefore, ideally, you will be educated alongside people who are also religious. So if we look at the minority who are religious today, they're likely to do things such as home educate. They're likely to do things that will withdraw their children or family members from some of the secular influences that are out there, in the hope of creating, if you will, this sort of common sense of community, which is basically faith-based or faith-orientated. Now, it would be hard for religious minorities to do that in the 21st century, but it doesn't stop them from trying. The point about the point, I guess, about the time in the 1930s was this was a time when Catholicism had managed to become institutionalized throughout society in a myriad of ways. As far as the experience of the majority went. But that was not, as you say, unusual, because the West was a lot more Christian in those days. So Catholics and Protestants in different places went to church. I mean, if you read lots of books or watch dramas about America, or even just watch the news there, you can see that for large numbers of Americans, religion is still fairly much part of their lives in ways that it might not be, say, in parts of Europe. So religion always has this communal aspect to it.
I think Catholics
that,
and Protestants understood each other in the sense of their understanding of belief and religion in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. They might have had a discommon discourse, if you like, in the minutiae of religion, but they understood the idea of devotion and belief, and that they had in common. So there was a commonality there, which I think we are in danger of possibly underestimating, if you like, at the time. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ian. We're going to move to Barry next.
Okay, thanks, Bryan. Thanks a million. That was fantastic. Trying to gather my thoughts here after hearing from a few different people. The fact that your paper looks at different locations of the Eucharistic Congress, and I suppose this ties into your critique of Diarmaid Ferriter's view about religion being imposed or willingly embraced. It struck me that you mentioned the 1881 Congress in Lille. After that, there was another French. A
few more.
So in the years after that, you see an explosion, probably the first flourish of French Catholic action with people like Count Albert de Mun and Francois René de la Tour de Pin, people like that. There's a parallel to be seen there with what happens in the years after the Dublin 32 Congress, and even in South America with the 1934 Congress. With that being said, the Catholic action groups play an enormous role in the years after. They do in the staging of it, as Maurice Curtis has noted in relation to Dublin. But shifting the focus onto these Catholic action groups, whereas, before we look at it from a hierarchical point of view, do you see in the limited historiography of the Eucharistic Congresses that there's a shift to the movements from below in terms of how the Congresses come about and their legacy?
I don't know about a shift to below. I know that that here and there you will find accounts of Eucharistic Congresses written contemporaneously. So, for example, I quoted one from around 1932 itself, written in Ireland, which was a history. So these tend to focus on these kinds of movements. Some historians will focus more on social movements now than they might have in the past, certainly. But the thing about it is that once you start looking at places like Lille, the driver of the Eucharistic Congress movement, if you will, is not just in the Eucharistic Congresses, but in other sorts of other similar kinds of events as well. So it's the idea of creating a Catholic civil society. So it's a top-down thing and a bottom-up thing. It depends on basically lay Catholics who are very dedicated. At the same time, there's also basically, if you will, a Rome strategy of basically creating this kind of Catholic civil society or fostering it. I mean, if you look at the extent to which in Ireland and elsewhere, Catholic leaders, church leaders, priests and so on, lead youth groups, prayer groups, all manner of other things, and figures like Flag Duff come along. So there are all these other figures, and what they're essentially doing is they're creating this kind of space beyond the church within which people practice their religion, but also it kind of focuses it can focus politically in very negative ways. I think, for example, in 1904 in Limerick, Father Craig kind of urging the confraternities there to rise up against the Jewish population of the city at the time. So basically, they can be politically mobilized, I guess. It's not all for the good. But certainly any of the stuff I've been looking at, the sort of history of Catholic social thought in Ireland, most of the articles are much more concerned with setting up youth clubs and organizations rather than basically talking about ideas and philosophy and theology. Certainly. So it's really about kind of creating this sort of thickening infrastructure. So even when I look at sort of fairly modern communities in Dublin, like the one close enough to me, not Crumlin, where I kind of talked about the sort of the road layout there that was mentioned earlier also, but places like Temple Oak, built in the 1970s or so. So you build a church, you build a Catholic school beside it, you have a big GA playground beside that, and then all the houses go around that. It's designed to replicate a Catholic village. It's designed then to have social groups and community groups and youth groups that help bolster some of that. It's designed to retain in an urban modernized context some aspects of that Gemeinschaft. I think that kind of some of the key figures, intellectuals and church leaders who have kind of studied, if you will, the dangers of their potential decline, have always preferred and idealized something akin to a rural community with thick interdependencies where people follow the rules locally because otherwise they would be shunned. So people feel obliged to do what everybody else does in the village. So that, the Catholic Church's own very ideal, even into modernity, was a medievalism. The idea of a medieval social order. But this really meant basically people living lives within which it was easy to nurture the faith. So I would sort of say that the kind of, yes, maybe I don't know much about the historiography of basically the study of social movements, really. But what I get a sense of is that certainly the church leaders would have understood that this kind of thick civil society or kind of communal infrastructure that could be built and perhaps led or fostered or encouraged by local priests would be immensely important for keeping people devout.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So we're going to move to Brian. Brian Lumpkin, over to you.
Hello.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks very much, Brian. Just following on from that, you touched on the report by A.E.C.W. Spencer, the English Catholic sociologist, and its suppression that was commissioned by the Catholic bishops of England and Wales. I wonder, could you say a little bit more about that for its significance for your main theme?
Well, it's incidental, perhaps. I mean, I just remembered it when I was looking at some of the literature here on this, because I've previously done a study of migration. I did a book on immigration from an immigration to Ireland, 1600 to the near present. And, obviously when I was trying to understand better the sort of ways in which Catholic organizations worked with and supported Irish immigrants in the United Kingdom, this piece of research kind of came up in the literature. It was definitely something well worth reading. So the idea that people abandoned their faith, as then amplified, yes, but not as much specific detail. I mean, Spencer's was giving very kind of clear evidence of this. And it was would have been a very kind of, I guess, controversial report to publish at the time. But I imagine in a sense it surprised nobody. And that it possibly led to the sort of intensification of efforts by some clergy to essentially do community work amongst Irish immigrants in the United Kingdom and so on and so forth. So you get Catholic housing associations set up, you get various other things done there. And you get basically action groups for Irish youth. I remember when I was in London for 10 years going to a meeting of one such group. So those kinds of things, in a sense, were efforts by the Catholic Church to serve as missionaries amongst the diaspora. And that's something the Catholic Church has been doing in one shape or form ever since large-scale migration from Ireland commenced. So in other words, the Catholic Church followed migrants to Australia, the Americas, Canada, and so on and so forth, but also to the United Kingdom. So in a sense, their job there was to basically bolster faith in these very different surroundings. So yeah, they would have had quite a detailed handle on what the issues were. It's just that Spencer's report was remarkably frank. It was a detailed social survey. It had percentages. It had a lot of stuff there. It was strongly evidence-based in that sense. And yes, it was suppressed at the time because basically it could not have served the purposes of the church well to have that out there, I guess, And it kind of emerges then into public knowledge around 2005, I think, But certainly what this just does is I think it kind of backs up the sorts of claims and arguments made by people like Frank Duff, who are really writing based on their impression as to what's going on. So one's impression as to what's going on is valuable, but it basically is just backed by this kind of evidence. So again, that kind of points again towards us maybe rethinking perhaps what is actually happening in Irish Catholic religiosity. It's deeply communal, it's very ritualistic, it's about going to church, it's about many other things. It's about all these kinds of folkways. They've all become embedded there. They have a deep meaning to many people. There are many people who would say a genuine faith there. And then there are others who, when they leave, they just go on, they kind of move over to whatever the local arrangements are, perhaps to a considerable extent. So again, this is not unusual for people who are religious leaders to claim or understand that the practice of faith, ritual, the practice of ritual, communal bonds, being surrounded by people with similar beliefs as your own, all these things are likely to shore up your commitment to a certain kind of way of living, and remove a person from those, and you're likely than to go astray. Literally, you're now a sheep away from the pack. You know, you're a strayed sheep. You know, you're a lost sheep. To quote older books than Spencer's.
That's very helpful. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks, Brian. And Brian, I think the last question goes to Lisa, if you're still there.
I am.
Great.
Hi. Thanks, Brian, for your talk. It was great. And I really agree with you that there isn't enough emphasis on sort of that people actually had a belief, and that's part of it, and they weren't just kind of being ordered around and kind of there just for the spectacle. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the kind of historiography of religion in Ireland, because I'm finding that at one stage, you know, historians would act as if you can't really historicize religion as such, because you can historicize, say, belief, you can historicize particular church figures and so on, but trying to get at the history of kind of religious belief is always going to be tricky. And maybe at one stage in Ireland, a lot of historians were believers themselves. So, you know, they'd say, well, the faith persisted because it's transcendent of kind of human history. And then, and then more recently, though, you'll find, I think, like, poor Dermot Ferrier, but it's a line in his book where he says, you know, X many people showed up for the Pope in 1979, and he has this line, but was it more cultural than religious, as if the two of them can be divided away from each other. And I think, I think it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
One of the things I looked at in the past was Irish journals. So I did a book a number of years ago where I looked at a number of Irish journals, and I pretty much read all the articles, and then I tried to basically capture the sort of ebb and flow of arguments. That book is called The Quest for Modern Ireland, 1912 to 86. And one of the journals I looked at was Studies. It wasn't the only Catholic journal I looked at. I also looked at the sociology journal Christus Rex. Imagine having the Irish sociology journal called Christus Rex. The Irish journal, the name of the Irish journal of sociology is Christ the King, right? So this kind of, and then it changed its name to Social Studies, and then it changed its name in the early 90s to the Irish Journal of Sociology. So quite clearly then, what counts as knowledge, and you know, we get these kinds of paradigm shifts for writing about Irish society. So that's certainly one angle of it that I can think of as a sociologist. So certainly a genealogy of that there are different modes of writing about Ireland in certain academic fields. Sociology I know quite well. So for example, you know, up to maybe 10 years ago, you know, Irish sociology, unlike Irish history, does not have a canon of wonderful works. I couldn't point you to 10 or 15 fabulous books to read. They just don't exist. Whereas there are many fine works of literature, because history is closer to the story of the tribe. It attracts wider audiences and so on and so forth. So yes, there was a historiography of books there. But I would sort of say with Irish sociology, before going to Irish history then, is that up till very recently, the story of Irish sociology was the story of secularization and urbanization and deruralization. So
and was
one
that
of the strongest areas of Irish sociology.
Was that a kind of Weberian sense of religion, as in kind of like modernity?
No, it was just obviously important. I mean, probably one of the better sociologies of Ireland is Tom Inglis's book Moral Majority. So basically how Catholicism became institutionalized in others. Yeah. It's a book I'd commend to you. I know
it very well, but I just think that argument that, you know, that this is just legalistic or orthodox, and that modernity is
okay. So yeah, that's not really there'll be different sort of qualities of work there. If you look at journals such as Studies, for example, I mean, up until 1980, serious academics published in Studies, because there wasn't the plethora of journals there are there now. So you had some of the leading figures publishing articles in Studies. So Studies was basically a mainline intellectual journal, but it was framed by the Jesuits as a Catholic thing. Since the 1980s, this has not been the case. So basically, academics are writing in different ways. They're writing with different audiences in mind. They're being edited by different kinds of people. History itself, history departments included clerics, you know, up to a certain time. You know, in the 1970s, most professors of sociology and many other professors of philosophy in Southern universities were priests. They aren't anymore. So at one stage, basically, if you will, church and academia were much closer. And I guess people were more respectful of those norms. I would imagine that I would imagine that for an awful lot of people writing about Irish society now, or even thinking about Irish society, who are not specialists as historians in certain issues and debates of the past and religious figures and religious movements, or indeed the cultural issues around these, but in general, religion and its decline is not a question that interests people in the way that it used to. At one stage, it was the big question. Ireland was a religious country. Now it's becoming less so. What's happening? How can we understand this? This is not a puzzle that basically captures imaginations in the way that it used to, because basically, in a sense, basically, this is yesterday's problem, and it's not seen as a sort of a problem or even as a crisis by many. So in other words, basically, we're coming at it from a very different mindset or vantage point in terms of thinking about it in the round. And I imagine this has affected most disciplines who write about these things. So we always write about things for our own purposes and from our own vantage points anyway, unless we are perhaps deeply concerned with or trying to authentically understand certain things that happened in the past, such as a good historian might do. So basically, those things are being done all the time by very good scholars, and there are perhaps even more scholars doing these things well now than there have ever been in the past. But it doesn't make the headlines, and it doesn't make its way into the mainstream narratives. So when I picked out Ferter's book as an example, I mean, here's somebody who knows an awful lot about Catholic past, but doesn't see any particular reason to treat it seriously, and writes about it in a way perhaps that might not have been written about a few decades earlier. And that just kind of, I find that fascinating. Also that he would tell that particular anecdote, or not just in a book, but in an Irish Times article he produces, presumably drawn in his earlier text, and then on Sean O'Rourke when interviewed about it. So the same anecdote gets rolled out. But his source for this anecdote is McGill. Or actually, it's actually not even McGill, it's actually a secondary source about McGill. So the idea basically that we can distance ourselves so much from the past that it's just basically something that we don't have to take seriously, or certain aspects of it. That points to me, as somebody who's into sociology, to a profound set of changes in how it suits us or interests us to think about the world. So we are looking at the past with a very, very different set of eyes than the past. So when I call my thing Roadside Picnic, and I remember the science fiction novel I read, it's not that the book has any profound sense here. It was, if you would, a reminder to myself that when we look at things that are left from the past and by others whose cultural context is very different, that we can't really presume to fully understand this. And I think that would just be my point. I imagine that many of the people here today understand it very well indeed, but basically, certainly as a reminder to myself that I cannot fully understand it. So I guess that's all of it. So in terms of historiography, I don't think it breaks down that neatly. I know there is basically a certain amount of writing about historiography in Ireland. There's less of it about other disciplines. But I would imagine basically that, loosely speaking, it ties in with broader social shifts as to what the important questions are considered to be. So in other words, every era has its set of preoccupations, and the preoccupation of the early 21st century is not how do we keep religion going or why are we losing our faith. Those aren't the preoccupations at all. It's kind of, and it now becomes kind of you basically, people are thinking about religion. I think in the past, you kind of said it yourself, like historians of a few generations ago, presumed that their audience knew all this stuff very well, so perhaps didn't need to belabor it. Whereas perhaps maybe some historians today, the ones who write the general narratives I'm talking about, not necessarily the ones who are writing detailed studies of particular things, that they are perhaps less interested, or presume their audiences are less interested. I guess that was my point, or at least that was my only point with that.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are more people looking at history of emotions and maybe histories of everyday life now that the decade of
even the idea of looking at emotion rather than faith.
That might generate more work on everyday experience of religion rather than necessarily his religion as a structure or whatever. So anyway, hope so. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay. And I really loved your paper.
Oh, thanks.
I really did, yeah.
Thanks, Lisa, and thanks, Brian. I think it's obviously a tribute to the kind of the stimulation of Brian's paper that has given rise to such a lively and extended and wide-ranging discussion. But we are out of time, so I'm going to have to bring the guillotine down. I'm sure we could continue talking about these issues for quite a while, and hopefully we will in other formats. my responsibility now is really just to invite you all to thank Bryan for presenting to us this afternoon in the traditional way by giving a round of applause. So can we do that?
Thank you.